The crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows. Across the marble floors of Belmont's, the most exclusive restaurant in Manhattan, where a single reservation could cost more than most families spent on groceries in a month. But amid the clinking of champagne flutes and the murmur of power, brokers discussing their latest acquisitions, there was a sound that didn't belong, the broken, gasping sobs of a child who had everything money could buy, yet possessed nothing his heart truly needed. Marcus Chen sat frozen in his leather chair, his $1,000 suit suddenly feeling like a straitjacket as he watched his 7-year-old son, Julian, dissolve into tears over an untouched plate of lobster thermidor. Around them other diners cast disapproving glances, their expressions a mixture of judgment and discomfort. Marcus felt his jaw tighten, that familiar cocktail of helplessness and frustration rising in his chest. He'd built a tech empire from nothing, had negotiated billion-dollar deals without flinching, had been featured on the cover of Forbes 3 times. Yet here, in this moment, he was utterly powerless. "Julian, please," Marcus said quietly, reaching across the table. His son flinched away from his touch, and that small movement hurt more than any business failure ever could. "We talked about this. You need to eat something." But Julian couldn't stop crying. His small shoulders shook with the force of emotions too big for his little body, and Marcus felt the weight of every mistake he'd made as a father pressing down on him like a physical thing. Since Sarah's death 2 years ago, nothing had been the same. The cancer had taken her quickly, efficiently, the way it does when it's already won before anyone realizes there's a war. And in its wake, it had left a man who didn't know how to be both mother and father, and a boy who was drowning in a grief he couldn't articulate. Marcus had tried everything: therapists, child psychologists, a rotation of nannies who came highly recommended, but never lasted more than a few months. He'd rearranged his schedule, turned down acquisitions, even considered stepping down as CEO, but Julian only seemed to retreat, further into himself, the light in his eyes dimming a little more each day. Tonight's dinner was supposed to be special, a celebration of Julian's birthday, but like everything else Marcus tried, it was falling apart. "I want Mommy," Julian whispered through his tears, and the words landed like a punch to Marcus's gut. "I just want Mommy back." Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but the words stuck in his throat. What could he possibly say that would make this better, that would take away even a fraction of this pain? He'd failed at the one thing that mattered most, and all the money in the world couldn't fix it. That's when she appeared. She was maybe 5 years old, with dark curls escaping from a somewhat messy ponytail and a purple dress that had clearly seen better days. She'd wandered away from a table in the corner, where a woman who was presumably her mother sat, with several shopping bags from discount stores, so out of place in Belmont's that Marcus wondered if they'd gotten lost and stumbled in by accident. The little girl walked right up to their table with the fearless confidence that only very young children possess, completely oblivious to the social boundaries that adults construct. She studied Julian with serious brown eyes, her small face scrunched up in concentration, as if she was solving a particularly difficult puzzle. "Why are you sad?" she asked Julian directly, ignoring Marcus entirely. Julian hiccuped, surprised out of his crying by this unexpected intrusion. He wiped his nose with the back of his hand, staring at the girl with red-rimmed eyes. I miss my mom. She died." The little girl nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense. Then she leaned in closer, cupping her small hand around her mouth, and whispered something in Julian's ear. Marcus strained to hear, but couldn't make out the words. Whatever she said, though, it made Julian's eyes widen. "Really?" Julian asked, his voice still thick with tears, but carrying a note of something else now: curiosity, maybe even hope. The girl nodded enthusiastically. "Uh-huh. My brother was sad all the time, too, after our daddy left. He'd cry, and Mama didn't know what to do. But then I came along, and you know what? He wasn't sad anymore, because he had me. And we could be sad together, except together wasn't as sad. It was more like half sad, and sometimes not sad at all." She straightened up, looking quite pleased with herself, and announced loudly enough for Marcus to hear, He only needs a sister." The words hung in the air like a revelation. Marcus felt something shift in his chest. A door he hadn't even known was closed, suddenly cracking open. It was so simple, yet he'd never considered it. Not because it wasn't possible, adoption, surrogacy. There were options, but because he'd been so locked in his own grief, so focused on just surviving each day, that he hadn't allowed himself to think about the future, about growth, about adding to their family rather than simply trying to patch the hole in it. Before Marcus could respond, the little girl's mother rushed over, her face flushed with embarrassment. "Lily! Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry," she said, taking her daughter's hand. She was younger than Marcus, probably in her late 20s, wearing a uniform from the mall's food court under her jacket. "She just ran off before I could stop her. We were just leaving. I promise we won't bother you anymore." "No," Marcus said quickly, surprising himself. "Please don't apologize. Your daughter. She just did something remarkable." The woman looked confused, but Lily beamed up at him. "I helped," she announced proudly. Marcus looked at Julian, who was staring at the little girl with an expression Marcus hadn't seen on his son's face in 2 years. Genuine interest. A spark of life. "Would you like to stay for dessert?" Marcus heard himself ask. "Both of you, please. It's my son's birthday." The woman, she introduced herself as Rosa, hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Sir, we couldn't possibly. This restaurant. I was just cutting through to get to the bus stop, and Lily needed to use the bathroom. I didn't even know kids were allowed to use the restrooms without—" "Please," Marcus repeated, and there was something in his voice that made her pause. "I'd really like you to stay. Julian would too. Right, buddy?" Julian nodded, wiping his face with his napkin. "Can she?" he asked, looking at his father with the first hint of a smile Marcus had seen in weeks. Can Lily stay? So they stayed, and over birthday cake that the confused, but professional waitstaff hurried to prepare. Marcus learned about Rosa's life, her 2 jobs, her tiny apartment in Queens, her determination to give her 2 kids everything she'd never had. He learned that Lily's brother was 8, and had indeed struggled after their father, abandoned the family, but that Lily had somehow pulled him out of his darkness with her relentless sunshine. And he watched as Lily and Julian talked, their conversation wandering from favorite colors to whether dinosaurs could swim to why grown-ups were always so serious. Julian laughed, actually laughed at something Lily said about her teacher, and the sound was so unexpected, so precious, that Marcus felt tears prick his own eyes. When the evening finally ended and Marcus called his driver to take Rosa and Lily home over her protests, which he gently but firmly overruled, Julian held onto his father's hand in the car, really held it for the first time since the funeral. "Dad," Julian said quietly as they drove through the glittering, nighttime streets of Manhattan. "Yes, buddy. Do you think I could have a sister? A real one?" Marcus squeezed his son's hand, looking down at the small face turned up toward his with such vulnerable hope. "You know what? I think that might be exactly what we both need." The process wasn't simple or quick. Marcus dove into it the way he did everything, with complete focus and determination. But this time, it wasn't about building a business or closing a deal. This time it was about building a family, and that required something different entirely. It required opening his heart to possibilities he'd been too afraid to consider, to the terrifying risk of loving again when love had already cost him so much. He stayed in touch with Rosa, at first just sending thank you gifts that she tried to refuse, then gradually developing a genuine friendship. She became an unexpected guide, teaching him things about parenting and resilience that no book or therapist had managed to convey. Lily and Julian had playdates, and Marcus watched his son come back to life piece by piece. 6 months later, Marcus met Emma. She was 3 years old, with gap-toothed smile and eyes that had seen too. Much sadness for someone so small. She'd been in foster care since birth, passed between homes that were never quite right. When the social worker showed Marcus her file, he'd seen his own son's grief reflected in this little girl's story, 2 children, who'd lost so much, who needed each other even if they didn't know it yet. The first time Julian met Emma at the adoption agency, he'd brought her a stuffed rabbit that had belonged to his mother. Marcus had almost stopped him, had almost said that maybe they should keep that it was too precious to give away. But Julian had looked at him with a wisdom beyond his 7 years and said, "Mum would want her to have it." Sisters share. Emma had clutched that rabbit and looked up at Julian with absolute devotion, and Marcus had known this was right. This was what Lily had seen that night in the restaurant, what his broken heart had been too clouded to recognize. They weren't replacing Sarah or trying to forget her. They were honoring her by choosing to love again, by opening their home and hearts to a child who desperately needed both. The adoption finalized on a Tuesday in October, unseasonably warm with autumn leaves skittering across the courthouse steps. Rosa and her kids were there, along with Marcus's team from the office who'd become something closer to family over the past year. As Marcus lifted Emma, now officially Emma, Chen, into his arms and felt Julian press against his side, he finally understood what he'd been missing. He'd been so focused on what they'd lost that he'd forgotten they could still gain something, not as a replacement, never that, but as a continuation of the love Sarah had started, growing and evolving into something new. That evening he took both kids back to Belmont's. The maître d' remembered them, and this time their table was full of laughter instead of tears. Emma was shy at first, overwhelmed by the fancy surroundings, but Julian talked to her in a gentle voice, explaining the menu and promising she could try his dessert if she didn't like hers. As Marcus watched his children, both of them now, truly, he caught a glimpse of a family in the corner. A mother dining alone with a teenage son who looked miserable, the two of them sitting in silence that felt heavy even from across the room. Marcus saw the mother's helpless expression, recognized it from his own reflection 2 years ago. He excused himself and walked over to their table. The woman looked up, surprised and slightly defensive. "I'm sorry to intrude," Marcus said gently, "but I was sitting where you are not too long ago, if you'd like to talk, or if there's any way I can help." He handed her his card, then added something he never would have before. Sometimes the answer isn't what we think. Sometimes we need to add to our lives instead of just trying to fix what's broken. He didn't know if she'd call, if his words would mean anything to her. But he'd learned something important from a 5-year-old. Girl in a purple dress. Sometimes the smallest voices speak the biggest truths, and sometimes what we need most is simply someone brave enough to whisper it. Back at their table, Julian was teaching Emma how to properly use the fancy silver utensils, both of them giggling as she held her fork like a shovel. And Marcus Chen, Billionaire CEO who'd thought he had all the answers, sat down with his children and gave thanks for the night he'd learned he was wrong, for the little girl who'd seen what he couldn't, and for the sister his son had always needed, but neither of them had known to ask for.